Welcome, travelers, to Terrors in the Wild, where the line between myth and reality blurs in the darkest corners of the earth. Here, we unravel the most terrifying cryptids, dive deep into chilling horror stories, and explore the mysteries that haunt the wilderness. From shape-shifting monsters to forgotten legends, we uncover the creatures and tales that lurk just beyond the reach of human understanding. So, keep your wits sharp, hit that subscribe button, and prepare for a journey into the unknown. The wild is waiting, but beware. It's not just the animals you should fear.
Whispers in the Pines, a Montana ranger's nightmare. When Montana's rugged wilderness calls, it's not just a whisper, it's a roar that carries the weight of the land's secrets, of the things that move in the shadows between the pines. Emily Bradford, M for short, had always loved the wild, the silence of the towering trees, the way the snow-capped peaks watched over the land like silent guardians. As a park ranger in Glacier National Park, she had learned to appreciate the solitude. But solitude can be deceptive, and the wilderness hides more than just animals. It hides nightmares. It was meant to be just another routine patrol for Emily, a walk through the forest, checking in on some remote cabins, making sure everything was secure. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the wild whispered something darker, something that would change her life forever. Em had been a ranger for nearly 5 years now, each day spent patrolling the vast wilderness of Glacier National Park. She loved her job, the quiet mornings, the fresh air, and the occasional hiker who'd wander off the trail and need rescuing. She'd always been drawn to the beauty of the mountains, their jagged peaks slicing through the clouds like natural fortresses. There was something primal about this land. It demanded respect. Today had been uneventful. She had checked the permits at the campground and made sure the trailheads were clear of fallen debris. She'd even caught sight of a mountain goat along the cliffs, standing still like a sentinel. The mountains were alive with the usual sounds, the calls of birds, the rustling of squirrels in the underbrush. But as the day wore on, the woods began to grow eerily quiet. By the time Em arrived at the isolated cabin near the northern edge of the park, dusk was falling. The cabin was a long way from any main roads, and the trail leading to it was seldom used. The isolation made it one of Em's favorite stops. It felt like stepping into another world, untouched by the noise of civilization. It was a small wooden structure, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of years. A single light flickered inside. Em approached cautiously, her flashlight in hand, her boots crunching the frost-covered ground. As she neared the door, she noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. The door was ajar, not by much, but enough that a draft had forced the wood to creak in protest. "Hello?" she called out, knocking gently. No answer. She pushed the door open, the hinges groaning as it swung inward. The inside of the cabin was dark, save for the dim glow of a lantern near the fireplace. The air inside smelled of damp wood and something else, something metallic. "Anyone in here?" Em asked, stepping further inside. Her flashlight swept across the room, illuminating the stone fireplace and the small, battered furniture. But as her eyes settled on the far wall, her stomach twisted. There, scrawled in what appeared to be dried blood, were the words, "They watch from the trees." Em's heart skipped a beat as she stared at the words on the wall. It wasn't just the eerie message that disturbed her. It was the way it was written. The letters were jagged, uneven, like they had been scraped into the wood with some sharp object. Her fingers tingled as she resisted the urge to reach out and touch the blood, unsure of its origin. "Okay, keep it together, Em," she whispered to herself. "This could be a prank, A stupid prank. But something gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. This wasn't just some careless joke. Her hand hovered over the radio on her belt. If she called in, it would take at least an hour for backup to get to her. And given how remote this area was, it could be much longer than that. She made a mental note to report the incident as soon as she could. But for now, she needed to be sure no one was here. She moved cautiously through the cabin, checking the small rooms. Everything seemed in order. No sign of struggle, no blood spatter, no broken windows. The only odd thing was the strange message. Still, Em felt uneasy. She walked back to the front door, ready to leave, when something caught her eye. A shadow flitted across the frosted window. Her breath hitched. Someone was outside. Em froze, her instincts kicking in. She was alone in a secluded part of the park, miles from the nearest ranger station. The woods were vast, and the chances of running into another person out here were slim to none. She stepped quietly toward the window and peeked through the gap in the blinds. A figure was standing just outside, motionless, staring at the cabin. Em's pulse quickened. The figure didn't move. It was tall, its outline dark against the fading light of the sky. She couldn't make out any features, just the silhouette of a person, standing unnaturally still. She grabbed her radio, but her hand froze halfway to her belt. The figure moved. It didn't walk. It glided, with an unnatural fluidity that made Em's blood run cold. In the next instant, it was gone, vanishing into the trees without a sound. Her heart was racing now. Her mind screamed at her to leave, but the rational part of her kept her rooted to the spot. Whoever, or whatever that was, it was out there, waiting. After a few moments of tension-filled silence, Em made her decision. She grabbed her gear, took one last look at the cabin, and bolted for the truck. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, it wasn't human. Em didn't waste time. She reached her truck as quickly as she could, jumping into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut behind her. Her hands trembled as she started the engine, the cold night air creeping in through the cracked windows. She glanced in the rearview mirror but saw nothing behind her. Still, she couldn't shake the sense that she was being followed. She drove quickly, the headlights cutting through the thick darkness of the trees. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig, made her flinch. Her eyes darted from the road to the woods, scanning for any sign of movement. The farther she drove, the more oppressive the silence became. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. And then, there it was, again. A shadow, a shape, a figure, standing just beyond the edge of the road, partially obscured by the trees. Em's breath caught in her throat. She slammed on the brakes, her truck screeching to a halt. The figure didn't move. It was the same dark silhouette, tall and unnaturally still. Em's mind raced. She couldn't just keep driving, not with whatever that was out there. She grabbed her rifle from the passenger seat, her fingers cold but steady as she loaded it. Then she stepped out of the truck, her boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. "Hey!" she shouted into the night. "I don't know who you are, but you need to leave, now!" The figure didn't respond. It didn't even flinch. It just stood there, motionless, as if it hadn't heard her. Em's hand tightened on the rifle, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, she started to walk toward it. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air thick with an oppressive, unnatural stillness. When she was about 30 feet away, the figure finally moved. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything remotely human. The creature's long, twisted limbs stretched unnaturally as it turned toward her. Its face was gaunt, hollow-eyed, and twisted into a grotesque grin. It had the shape of a man, but its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow hue, and its skin seemed to ripple, like it was made of something other than flesh. "Get away," Em whispered, her voice shaking. It smiled, and then it lunged. Em fired before she could think. The shot rang out, echoing through the silent forest. The creature screamed, a horrifying, inhuman sound that pierced her ears. But the bullet didn't stop it. It didn't even slow down. She fired again and again. But with each shot, the creature only grew closer, its unnatural speed closing the gap between them in seconds. Em was running now, not thinking, just reacting. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees growing thicker, darker, as if they were alive and moving with the creature. She stumbled over roots and rocks, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The creature was still behind her, its footsteps heavy and relentless. The glow of its eyes lit up the trees around her, illuminating the path ahead. And then in the distance she saw it. The old ranger station. She was almost there, but as she sprinted toward it, the ground beneath her feet gave way. Her legs buckled and she fell forward, tumbling into a patch of soft earth. Before she could get up, the creature was upon her. Its long skeletal fingers wrapped around her arm, lifting her off the ground with terrifying strength. Em struggled, her heart hammering in her chest, but the creature only tightened its grip. Em's breath was ragged, her heart hammering in her chest as the creature's clawed hand dug deeper into her arm. The grip was like iron, unyielding, and for a moment she feared it might snap her bones like twigs. Every instinct in her screamed to break free, but the creature's gaze held her frozen, its eyes glowing an unsettling yellow in the dark. She struggled, kicking her legs and trying to pry its fingers off, but it was no use. The creature's strength was otherworldly, and the closer it pulled her, the more she felt like prey, caught in a predator's trap. In that fleeting moment of terror, she caught sight of its face, pale and gaunt, skin stretched tight over bone, with hollow eyes that radiated an unnatural glow. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It whispered something low, its voice a guttural rasp that made her skin crawl. "You shouldn't have come." The words were chilling, but the creature's voice was faint, like an echo from somewhere deep within the earth. Every bone in Em's body screamed to run, but she was rooted to the spot, her vision blurring, mind swirling in a fog of panic. Then, as if the creature had had enough of the game, it lifted her higher, its claws digging into her flesh like a vice. Em felt her breath leave her body as she was yanked into the air. Her feet dangled inches above the ground, and the pressure in her chest made it hard to think, hard to move. But even as her body screamed for air, something inside her clicked into place, an instinct, a deep survival urge that had been honed over years of working in the wild. She was a ranger. She was trained to survive in the wilderness. Her hand shot to the holster at her waist, and without hesitation, she pulled out her flashlight. With a swift, desperate motion, she swung the heavy object hard against the creature's skull. The sound of it connecting was sickening, like striking a tree trunk with a hammer. The creature howled, its grip loosening for just a moment. That was all Em needed. With a surge of strength, she broke free from its grasp and hit the ground hard. Pain shot up her legs, but she didn't stop. She scrambled to her feet and ran, her breath sharp in her throat, her boots pounding against the frozen ground. The creature didn't give chase immediately. Instead, it paused, as if toying with her, watching her with those sickly yellow eyes. The air around them was unnaturally still, and the trees themselves seemed to hold their breath. Then, just as she thought she might escape, she heard it, its footsteps, pounding the earth with terrifying speed. Em didn't look back. She ran, fueled by pure instinct. But the creature was faster, far faster than anything human. She could hear its heavy, uneven footsteps growing closer with each passing second, each one filled with the promise of death. Her mind raced. The ranger station was just ahead. But would she make it in time? The creature's shrill, mocking laughter echoed through the woods behind her. It was gaining on her. The ranger station loomed like a sanctuary, but Em knew it wasn't going to be enough. The station was run down, abandoned for years, and its old wooden structure was barely standing. Still, it was her only chance. She reached the door, her hands trembling as she fumbled for the handle. The creature's breath was hot on her neck now, and she could feel the weight of its presence, like a shadow over her. With one final desperate tug, the door creaked open. Em bolted inside and slammed the door shut, her heart racing as she leaned against it, gasping for air. The station was dark, save for the faint light of the moon streaming through the cracked windows. Her hands were shaking, and her mind struggled to process the sheer terror of the past few minutes. The creature stopped just outside, its heavy breathing audible through the walls. Em could hear it pacing, circling the cabin. She pressed her back against the door, trying to steady her breathing. But then, to her horror, she heard a voice, a whisper, soft but unmistakable. It came from within the cabin. "You can't hide from us." Em's blood ran cold. She spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The beam illuminated an old wooden table, a few rusted chairs, and a long-forgotten map pinned to the wall. But there, just beyond the light, something moved. She froze. A shape, a shadow. Two more figures standing silently in the corner of the cabin, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Em's pulse quickened as she raised her rifle, her hands trembling. But they didn't move. They just stood there, watching her with an intensity that felt like they were inside her mind, reading her every thought. "Leave now, Ranger." The voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. Em's grip tightened on her rifle. There were at least 3 of them now. 3 creatures, their eyes glowing like lanterns in the dark, their twisted bodies barely visible in the shadows. They had appeared out of nowhere, and she had no idea how many more were out there, hidden in the woods. They were everywhere, and the forest itself seemed to be alive with their presence. She backed toward the small desk in the corner, her mind racing for a plan. She couldn't fight them all, and even if she did, she had no way of knowing what they were or where they came from. The wild had always been a place of mystery, but this was something beyond anything she had ever faced. This was something ancient. One of the creatures took a step forward, its elongated fingers twitching as it reached out. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body hunched and unnatural. Its face was twisted, the skin stretched tight over a skull-like structure, its eyes glowing brighter with every step it took. Em fired. The bullet tore through the air, but it passed straight through the creature's form, as though it wasn't even there. The creature didn't flinch. It only smiled, a hideous grin that seemed to stretch unnaturally wide. The creatures were mocking her, toying with her, and she knew then that they weren't here to kill. Not yet. They were here to terrorize. "You shouldn't have come," the first creature whispered, its voice a low rasp that scraped against M's sanity. "This place belongs to us." The weight of its words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her mind raced. The park, the wilderness. It wasn't just a refuge for the wild things. It was theirs, and she was just a trespasser. But M wasn't ready to go down without a fight. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for anything she could use. Then she saw it, an old fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. She grabbed it, her hands moving quickly and with purpose. The creatures were still moving closer, their eerie footsteps growing louder. M's breath quickened, but she knew she couldn't hesitate any longer. With a sudden movement, she yanked the fire extinguisher off the wall, pulling the pin as she turned toward the creatures. She aimed it at the first one, squeezing the trigger. A cloud of foam erupted from the nozzle, hitting the creature square in the face. It screamed, a guttural sound that filled the room with terror, and staggered back, momentarily blinded. M didn't wait to see if it was down. She sprinted for the door, her heart pounding in her chest. As she burst outside into the cold night air, the world seemed to spin. The creature's howls echoed behind her, but she didn't look back. She ran, knowing she couldn't outrun them forever, but determined to survive. The ranger station was behind her, the woods ahead of her, filled with the unknown. But she wasn't alone in this fight. Whatever was watching her from the shadows, whatever nightmare she had unleashed, it wasn't going to get the best of her. Not tonight. M ran through the dense forest, her legs aching, but adrenaline kept her moving. The creatures weren't far behind. She could hear their unnatural movements, the soft rustling of their twisted forms cutting through the brush. She could feel their presence closing in on her. The sound of their footsteps was deafening now, but she refused to slow down. She stumbled through the trees, the ground beneath her feet uneven and treacherous, but she pushed forward. The memories of her training, of every survival tactic she had learned as a ranger, surged through her. The wild was her domain. She knew the woods better than anyone. But this was something else. She rounded a bend and came face to face with a sheer cliff wall. No way forward. Her chest heaved with the effort, her heart pounding in her ears. The creature's growls echoed from behind, and she knew they were close, too close. Desperation clawed at her, and she turned, searching frantically for any sign of escape. And that's when she saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees, distant but real. The ranger station. It was too far for a straight shot, but it was the only chance she had. With every ounce of strength left in her body, she ran toward it, toward the safety that might or might not be waiting for her. M's breath was ragged, her legs heavy with exhaustion, but the faint glow of the ranger station's windows offered a sliver of hope in the oppressive dark. She couldn't tell how far ahead it was, only that it felt like the distance between her and safety stretched infinitely. The creatures behind her were relentless, their unnatural sounds growing louder with each passing second. She could hear their twisted footsteps, the occasional hiss of breath, and the low guttural growls that scraped at her sanity. The ground beneath her feet seemed to change with every step, the forest floor uneven and treacherous, but she didn't dare look back. She could feel them closing in, their presence like a weight on her chest, suffocating, terrifying. The trees around her felt like walls, like they were closing in on her, trying to trap her. Her mind raced as she pushed forward, each step more difficult than the last. She was running on pure instinct now, the fear and adrenaline overriding the pain in her body. She couldn't let them catch her. She wouldn't let them. Then Just as her vision began to blur, she stumbled into a clearing. The ranger station was there, just ahead, its wooden walls silhouetted against the dark sky. The lights flickered in the windows, casting a pale, ghostly glow across the clearing. Em's heart leapt. She wasn't done yet. She could make it. But just as she took her first step toward the station, she felt a sharp, searing pain rip through her side. A howl, inhuman, bone-chilling, filled the air as one of the creatures leaped from the shadows, its claws slashing through the air. Em screamed as she fell to the ground, the pain nearly blinding her. She twisted, reaching for her rifle, but her hand was weak, her grip faltering. The creature was upon her, its shadow swallowing her whole as it crouched over her. Its glowing eyes burned into hers, and for the first time she felt truly small, powerless. "You're too late, Ranger." The creature's voice rasped from somewhere deep within the hollow pit of its chest. It was low, almost mocking, and the air around it felt thick with an ancient malevolence. Em could barely breathe, her pulse hammering in her ears as the creature's claws scraped against her jacket, inching closer to her skin. She couldn't move, couldn't escape. She was at the mercy of something beyond comprehension, something old and wicked. But then, the ground trembled beneath her. The creature paused, its head snapping up, its ears twitching. For a moment, everything went still. A deep, rumbling growl rolled through the clearing, reverberating off the trees. The air grew colder, the shadows lengthened, and Em could see the creature's expression falter. It looked uneasy, even fearful. A loud crash echoed from the woods, and something massive pushed through the trees. Another creature, larger, stronger. Its form blurred in the darkness, but its eyes glowed a fiery red, and its body was far more imposing than the others. The first creature snarled, its eyes narrowing in confusion and frustration. It slowly backed away from Em, eyes locked on the new arrival. It wasn't running. It was wary, cautious. And then, in the blink of an eye, the two creatures locked in a violent, snarling battle. Em scrambled to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her side, ignoring the dizziness. Her breath was shallow, and her vision swam, but she didn't have time to process the danger. She couldn't let herself get caught in this fight. She had to get to the ranger station. Her fingers fumbled for her rifle, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear the creatures fighting behind her, their vicious growls and bone-crunching roars filling the night. She had only a few seconds to act. She couldn't let either of them get back on her trail. Her heart raced as she turned toward the ranger station. With everything she had left, Em sprinted across the clearing, making for the door. She didn't look back. She didn't want to know what was happening behind her. She just had to make it inside. The door creaked open as she threw herself against it, stumbling into the dimly lit room. She slammed it shut with trembling hands and locked it, leaning against the wooden frame, gasping for breath. Her body screamed in protest, but she ignored it. She had made it. For now. Em's eyes darted around the room, taking in her surroundings. The station was sparse, the walls lined with maps and old camping gear. The fireplace in the corner was long cold, and the dust in the air caught the faint glow of the moonlight. It was a place frozen in time, abandoned by the world, forgotten by the park itself. But it was hers, for now. She turned to the small desk near the wall, her mind moving in a haze of panic and exhaustion. Her fingers moved over the surface, pushing aside papers and old pens until she found a matchbook. A little more than a few matches and a thin, frayed string. But it would do. She grabbed the matches and quickly set about lighting a small fire in the hearth. her hand shaking as she fed the dry kindling. The crackling of the flames was a comforting sound, and as the fire took hold, she stepped back, her knees buckling beneath her. The heat felt like a balm to her chilled skin, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe. But even in the safety of the cabin, Em knew she wasn't out of the woods yet. The creatures had smelled blood. They wouldn't let her go that easily. She limped over to the window, peering through the cracked glass. The night outside was as dark and foreboding as ever, but the sounds of the battle had died down. She could still hear the occasional growl in the distance, but nothing approached. Not yet. There was a part of her, deep down, that knew she wasn't going to get out of this unscathed. Her side was throbbing with pain, and she was too far from help to expect rescue. It was just her, alone in the woods with things that didn't belong to this world, and yet she couldn't afford to give up. She had to hold on. She had to survive. For the park, for the people who still came here, unaware of the horrors that lurked in the shadows. The first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon, the faintest light creeping through the trees. Em could barely keep her eyes open. Her exhaustion was overwhelming, but as the fire crackled beside her, she stayed alert, listening, watching. And then, just as she was about to collapse into a chair by the fire, she heard it, the faintest sound at the edge of the woods. A whisper. "It's not over." Em's eyes snapped wide open. She slowly turned toward the door, her heart thumping in her chest. She wasn't alone.
As this story ends, remember, out here in the wild, the terrors never truly vanish. They're always watching, waiting. If you dare to face them again, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You never know when the next nightmare will find you. Until then, stay safe or stay scared.